Our next speaker is a fan favorite. Dr. Julie Kutac makes research relatable. She received her BS in molecular biology with a minor in theology from Texas Lutheran University, her MA in religious studies from Rice University, and her PhD in medical humanities from the University of Texas Medical Branch. As a professional education and research specialist at the Alzheimer's Association Houston and Southeast Texas chapter, Dr. Kutac prepares and delivers education programs to healthcare providers across the Houston area. She also works with the scientists studying Alzheimer's disease in the Texas Medical Center. Please welcome Dr. Julie Kutac as she presents New Horizons in Alzheimer's Research.
Can I use this one?
Hello?
Yeah. I can use this one. Okay, that's a hard act to follow. Hey. I'm sorry. Yeah, that's a really hard act to follow. I'm really excited to be here again this year for the second year in a row. Who was here last year? Oh, good. Okay, y'all are going to hear the same jokes. Get ready. Who's a professional caregiver here today? Okay, great. And who's turned into a professional caregiver because they're caring for family members? Yes. Okay. I'm turning into a caregiver. I have a family member who's now in the early stages. So my grandmother, both of my grandmothers had dementia. One had vascular dementia, one had Alzheimer's. And so I'm walking alongside y'all. And this is research that isn't just, it's not just out there, right? These are the things that affect our life. So I'm grateful to be here. I'm grateful to y'all for the work that you do and for the care that you provide and for the love that you provide every day. So we're going to talk about research. It's kind of, you may think it's a dry topic, but I think it's really interesting, so you're stuck with me for an hour. So here's what we're going to talk about. I'm coming from the Alzheimer's Association, and I want to talk a little bit about the ways that the Alzheimer's Association supports research. It's one of the coolest things because we are primarily a donor-funded organization, but we are the largest private funder of Alzheimer's research in the world. I'm going to then talk about highlights that came out of the 2018 Alzheimer's Association International Conference. So that's the largest conference on Alzheimer's disease and related dementias in the world, and that's where the newest, latest, greatest research comes out. And then I'll talk about ways that you can support dementia research, and hopefully there will be time at the end to talk about questions too. Okay, so when I came last year, the estimate was 5.7 million Americans were living with Alzheimer's. This year, in 2019, that number has gone up to 5.9 million. It's the most expensive disease, and there are generally 3 unpaid caregivers for every 1 person living with Alzheimer's. So that means that there are 16 million, over 16 million caregivers. And one of the things that I think is hard, and I'm so glad that Kim brought it up, is that Alzheimer's or dementia can feel like a really isolating disease, but with 16 million caregivers, you are not alone. So what happens in Alzheimer's? Here in 1906 is Dr. Alzheimer. And the first patient that was characterized to have Alzheimer's was a lady named Augusta. She was in her 50s and she has what we understand now to be younger onset Alzheimer's disease. Now, we were living in a scientific revolution back then, and I would argue that we're living in a scientific revolution now. Because back then, about 115 years ago, what scientists were learning how to do was to stain slides and look at cells underneath the microscope, and that's what they did. After Augusta passed away, he looked at her brain underneath the microscope and he found what are now considered to be the pathological hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease: the neurofibrillary tangles and the beta amyloid plaques. Okay, this is important to talk about because we need to know what's happening in the brain, and so this is going to be the heaviest sort of sciencey part of what we're talking about. So what happens in the brain during Alzheimer's disease? Beta amyloid is a protein. It's a protein that's in all of your brains. It's in my brain, it's in your brain, it's in all of our brains. It's floating around in between the cells. Nerve cells are long and they're branched. And they talk to each other using neurotransmitters and electricity. There are 100 million nerve cells inside every single one of your brains. So beta amyloid is this little tiny protein that's floating around in between those nerve cells, and for reasons that scientists don't entirely understand, another protein called amyloid precursor protein snips the beta amyloid, and it gets sticky. And the beta amyloid starts to stick to itself and stick to itself and stick to itself, and it creates plaques inside the brain. So how many of y'all have heard of the plaques? Well, that's what it is. Now you know that's what it is. So they're plaques that form inside the brain. The brain has the consistency of Jell-O. These plaques that form in the brain are as hard, they're really, really hard. They're harder than atherosclerotic plaques. And so if you imagine something really, really hard growing in Jell-O, now you can see that the brain cells can't talk to each other anymore. Now inside the nerve cell is another kind of protein called tau. And tau helps form a kind of a mini skeleton inside the cell. It helps give the cell its structure. And something happens to tau, tau gets very heavy and it collapses. So remember when I said those nerve cells are long and branched? Now they've collapsed and they tangle up on themselves, and underneath the microscope they look like a tangle of hair. So now the cells are tangled, they can't talk to each other, and they also die. So we have an onslaught both inside the cell and outside the cell. The tau is inside the cell, the beta amyloid is outside the cell. So the brain cells eventually die, and the brain with someone with Alzheimer's disease starts to shrink. Alzheimer's is a universally fatal disease. If someone lives long enough and doesn't die for another reason, that will be the cause, Alzheimer's will be the cause of their death. And I don't say that to be ugly, but I think it's an important thing for us to recognize. It's not a part of normal aging, and it affects more than just memory. Those plaques and tangles initially begin in the part of the brain called the hippocampus that controls the consolidation of short-term memory into long-term memory. Okay? So, what that means is that you're taking in a lot of information about everything, a lot of sensory information at any given time. And you're taking in information about me, and you're saying, she's short, she has curly hair, I like her top, I don't like her top, whatever. I'm trying to figure out what's the important information. I don't care if y'all like my top or not, that's fine, it's coming. But y'all are taking in that information, and probably in 3 months, you may remember I made a joke about it, but you're not going to remember what I actually wore. Because it's not that important, but you're going to remember some of the information that I gave you because that's important. Your brain is figuring out what's important and what's not, and what you're going to turn into long-term memory. But someone with Alzheimer's has that challenge. They can't change those memories into long-term memories. That's why some of the initial warning signs is the inability to learn new things. But that's not the only part that is affected. Also, the back part of the brain starts to develop plaques and tangles, and that's the part of the brain that controls vision. So a person with Alzheimer's has problems with depth perception, but not because they have an eye problem, although that could be the case. They could have cataracts, and cataracts are something we can deal with, but when we're talking about Alzheimer's, it's the way that the brain processes the visual imagery that you take in. It's also going to eventually affect balance. So the way that somebody perceives of themselves in the world becomes compromised. And finally, in the latest stages of the disease, the plaques and tangles start to go into the brain stem, and that controls involuntary movements like swallowing, breathing, digestion. And so when a person with Alzheimer's starts having problems swallowing, they start developing aspiration pneumonia because part of their spit is going down because that flap isn't covering right. Everybody swallowed. You didn't get spit in your lungs because you have a flap of tissue that helps with that. When that breaks down, it's time. Well, it's really past time to be talking about what comfort care looks like and end-of-life care looks like. Hopefully you've had those conversations already, but that signifies a transition that's happening. Now, the vast majority of people have late onset Alzheimer's, meaning that the Alzheimer's, the onset happens after the age of 65. But here's the thing about Alzheimer's. You don't just wake up one morning and you have Alzheimer's. It has an insidious onset. And that's because the plaques and tangles are starting to form 10 to 20 years before there are any clinical symptoms. So, but the vast majority develop late onset, but a very not insignificant number, 200,000 Americans are living with younger onset Alzheimer's disease, meaning that the symptoms emerge before the age of 65. And a very small number of people have inherited forms. Now, my great-grandmother had Alzheimer's, my grandmother had Alzheimer's, something is going on with a family member, and so I am very concerned about it. But I know this, dominantly inherited Alzheimer's, because really only about 3% of people in the world have that kind of Alzheimer's. It's very, very rare. Now, that's not to say there isn't a genetic component, but it's not fully understood. And we will talk about that a little bit more as we move forward. But I want to put your mind at ease that chances are you don't have that kind. The numbers from between 2000 and 2017, deaths from heart disease decreased 9%, while deaths from Alzheimer's increased 145%. In Texas alone, that number is 200%. Now, this is a shocking number, but I believe that research can help stem that tide. I believe that because research has helped stem the tide of other diseases, HIV, heart disease, a lot of cancers. And now we're turning our attention toward Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia. We're accelerating research, and I think we're starting to see the fruits of that investment. So here's the mission of the Alzheimer's Association. And you just heard a great speaker who talked about providing and enhancing care. And what I want to talk about is the first and the third, eliminating Alzheimer's disease through the advancement of research and reducing the risk of dementia through the promotion of brain health, which I think y'all also got to hear about. This is our vision. And I hope that one day I will be put out of work. So these are the 6 prongs of our mission that work together, and I want to talk about 2, public policy and accelerating research. So we advocate, and we have a sister arm called the Alzheimer's Impact Movement. It's a 501c4. But through our advocacy, the Congress allocated $2.37 billion to Alzheimer's and dementia research last year. When I started working at the Alzheimer's Association, that was in 2014, they allocated $562 million. That was almost the amount of the increase last year, from 562 to over 2 billion in 5 years. So research is accelerating, and it's due to our advocacy efforts. So when you have a chance to fill out those AIM cards in your packet, or to go to State Advocacy Day, or to talk to your local, state, and federal legislators, tell your stories. They matter. They absolutely matter. And through those advocacy efforts, that money has been raised, and that goes to the National Institutes of Health, and that money is allocated to Alzheimer's research, but we want to help too. And we advance research too. In a number of ways, we are the leading private nonprofit funder of Alzheimer's research in the world. Of course, we can't compete with governments, and the U.S. government is the largest funder, but we're the largest private funder, and what we can do is help high-risk, high-reward research get funded. This is often, we're more nimble than a big, giant government, and so we can help young or new emerging investigators get their work off the ground, and we can do these high-risk, high-reward investments. And this is the numbers. Since 1982, we've funded over $410 million to over 2,700 projects. We have a high-impact journal. We have the largest international conference. We have a academic group, a professional organization. And so we support research in a number of ways. Okay, so that's the background of what we do. Here's the good stuff. So in 2018, the AAIC, Alzheimer's Association International Conference, was held in Chicago. There were almost 6,000 people there from over 68 countries. So it really is international, global in scope. And there's some really cool things that came out of it that I want to tell you about. So I'm using the same strategy that I used last year, but the slides are different. Because I just can't get a handle on 2,500 research projects. I have to organize it in some way. So I like to organize it in terms of risk, diagnostics, and treatment therapies. So where are we in terms of risk? Okay, so here's what we know about genetic risk. Let's go in a little bit more in depth about that dominantly inherited Alzheimer's versus genetic risk. So the dominantly inherited Alzheimer's comes from a dominantly inherited gene. Imagine that. So genes, you get one set from your mom, you get one set from your dad. And they can be dominant or they can be recessive. And if you have this dominant gene, you are guaranteed to get it. It's dominant. That's very rare. It's so rare. But there are also genes that are risk genes. And that's just what it says. You're at risk of developing something. But, you know, y'all have seen those people who are elderly, and they've lived a life. They've lived a life. And you think their health should be worse, but it's actually pretty good. So just because you're at risk for something doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get it. And scientists have looked, and this busy, you know, picture over here is that there are 11 new potential focuses of genes that may be interacting with one another to increase risk or decrease risk. Is it so complicated yet? Have I lost you? You know? So it is super duper complicated. But the message that I want to leave you with is that scientists are looking at the genes, they're looking at the way the genes interact with one another, and I'm going to drop some knowledge on you right now. You can't control your genes. If you could, I would have straight hair and I would be 5'9". So we can't control our genes, so I encourage you not to obsess over that, because there's nothing we can do. We also can't control our age. And age is the greatest risk factor right now, but there is a heart-head connection. And the research around the connection between the brain and the heart is growing. What is good for the heart is good for the brain. And by the same token, you are at an increased risk if you have high blood pressure, heart disease, diabetes, high cholesterol. If you've had a head injury, and people who have had multiple head injuries are at a much higher risk of developing Alzheimer's. Wear helmets. Okay, so this is hot off the press from the 2018 AAIC. This research was just published in the Journal of the American Medical Association about a month and a half ago. It's really new. This is big, y'all. This is a potential game changer. And I don't say that lightly. So the study is called the Sprint Mind Study. It was a very large study, 9,000 people. And these people were 50 plus. They're healthy, but they have high blood pressure and at least one more heart risk, cardiovascular risk factor. So maybe they have high blood pressure and they have high cholesterol. Or they have high blood pressure and they're obese, something like that. Right now, the standard of care is to manage systolic blood pressure to 140. But what the study looked at was even more aggressive blood pressure management, down to 120. That's pretty significant to get blood pressure all the way down to 120. But they found in that study group that the people who had the aggressive blood pressure management were at a reduced risk for mild cognitive impairment, and they were at a reduced risk, combined risk, for MCI and dementia. And then they looked at their brains under a magnetic resonance imaging machine, an MRI machine, and they found that there was a reduction in white lesions, which are damaging to the brain. So this is something that could have actual impact in physician offices across the country. They looked, and I've heard people say, well, at 120, you're at a higher fall risk. But they've controlled for that. So there's more studies that are being done, but this is something to talk to your doctor about. I don't want to say, manage your blood pressure on your own without talking to your doctor, but it's worth very much having a conversation about, and you can get more information about this study on our Alzheimer's Association website, alz.org. There's a search engine inside the web page, and you would just kind of Google inside the web page Sprint Mind. When we're talking about risk too, the Lancet came out with a commission, and what they're saying is that they believe that 33%, up to 33% of all cases of dementia worldwide could be preventable. And there are interventions across the lifespan that have implications for the way that we care for people. So, this is so hard to see. But this is, so you imagine the squiggle is the lifespan, and each one of those lines coming around the squiggle is one of the interventions. So in early life, people are at a higher risk of developing Alzheimer's if they have less education. So early childhood education and education up to at least 11th grade is very important. This becomes an issue of social justice. In midlife, they found hearing loss, high blood pressure, and obesity. Hearing loss is something that we can, work to rectify. Obesity is something where we can make an intervention, and true for hypertension too. And in late life, so even in late life, there are things that we can do to help promote brain health and to potentially lower risk. And that's smoking, managing depression. Scientists have found depression to be a risk factor, but when the depression is managed, that risk seems to go away. Physical inactivity, diabetes, and social isolation. As someone who is very interested in ways that humans make meaning, we do it in community. Social isolation is very, very dangerous. And think about how many folks you know who are older who don't really have a lot of people coming around to visit them. So, looking at that picture in another way, in this kind of Venn diagram, the thing that is the best thing that you can do to promote brain health and to help reduce your risk is exercise. Exercise. I know. It's hard for me too. But you don't have to run a marathon. Just start doing something. Just doing a little bit, and then build up to it. It's really, really good for you. Okay. Also from AAIC, they looked at risk in women. So one of the questions I get all the time is, Dr. Kutac, are women at a higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease than men? And the answer is yes. And then the next question is, why is that? Is it because women live longer? And I said, well, I think that's part of it, but I don't think that's all of it. I think there's something else going on, and it turns out the scientists do too. It's not just that we live longer. By the way, women are at the epicenter of the crisis. And I'm a fellow female too. I don't want to have to tell you all that, but it is the truth. So they looked at another large study. Over 14,000 women in the Kaiser Permanente health system. And there was lower dementia risk was related to having more than 3 children, never having a miscarriage, having starting menses earlier or starting menopause later, and then the overall period of the overall reproductive life of a person. So this is interesting. I don't know what the implications are for it yet, but what I want to tell you is that scientists are looking more closely at what gender differences actually mean. So they're trying to parse that out. So maybe in a couple of years, I'll have even more information to give you about that. And then finally, when we're talking about risk, I have to tell you all about a really, really exciting study. This is the Finnish geriatric study, the Feiner Study for short. It's going to get even punnier in a minute, so put your punny pants on. But this was a pretty small trial, 1,200 people, but it was the gold standard of clinical trials, a randomized controlled trial. This took place in Finland, and it was the first solid evidence that you could do a cocktail of things and actually lower your risk of developing dementia. Because you'll notice I've been pretty cagey. I'm saying potentially lower your risk. The evidence supports it, but I can't say it's guaranteed, you know? But this Feiner study was the best evidence that we had. And what they did was they looked at physical exercise, social engagement, mental activity, and management of health conditions. So Finland eats a very different diet than the United States. You know, what are they eating in Finland? A lot of fish, not nearly as much brisket. So the study needs to be replicated in more diverse populations. Because folks in Singapore aren't eating the way that folks in India are, that are eating the way that folks in Chicago are, that are eating the way folks in South Texas are. And our population is much more heterogeneous. It's heterogeneous ethnically, it's more heterogeneous socioeconomically, and so scientists don't know if they could take those finger data and expand it out across the world. So what they've created now are the worldwide fingers. They're doing a finger in Australia, they're doing a finger in Japan, they're doing a finger in India. And they're doing one in the United States. And here's where the pun comes in. It's called the Pointer Study. Guys, tip your waitress. I can't make this stuff up. So they have announced, so this is a study that's being done out of Wake Forest, but it's being done in multiple sites across the United States. They've announced sites in Chicago, in California, in North Carolina, and they're going to announce more. They're looking to recruit 2,500 participants, so that's over double the size of the Feiner study. And they're getting healthy people between the ages of 60 and 79 who have a first-degree connection to Alzheimer's, and they're looking at different lifestyle engagement programs to see if those lifestyle engagement programs could lead to a lower risk of dementia. The Alzheimer's Association really believes in this, and we've invested $35 million into this Pointer study. It's a big project. It's one of the biggest investments that we've made into a single study. So I can't wait in a few years to tell y'all what the results are. And my hope is that we're going to see that lifestyle interventions can indeed really improve brain health as we age. Okay, let's talk about diagnostics. So one of the hardest things right now is getting a diagnosis for Alzheimer's or for another dementia. People aren't diagnosed. Less than 50% of people with dementia are diagnosed. And less than 50% of those people are then told their diagnosis. And one of the problems is that we haven't had a standardized approach to diagnostics. So in 2017, the Alzheimer's Association recognized that this was a problem and developed a diagnostic evaluation clinical practice guideline group. So primary care lacks a set of clear guidelines, but most people go to their primary care doctors to find out. And I have heard, I don't know how many stories of people who said, here's a prescription, come back in 6 months, peace. That's not good enough. So the gap leads to problems. I think it increases stigma about the disease. There's a reluctance to disclose or diagnose. That it leads to a lack of referral to specialists. It leads to lack of information about clinical trials. And it leads to a continuation of the culture of silence that we have around the illness, and it's one that I work to undo every day. So new from 2018, thank you all, were the first diagnostic practice guidelines for use in primary care settings. And here's what they are. Every person who self-reports memory changes, or who has a care partner who reports behavioral changes or cognitive changes, should have a full evaluation. The evaluation should include an investigation of causes and contributing factors, because it is known that not every set of symptoms, there are certain syndromes that present as dementia, but there are things that can be addressed and reversed, like low thyroidism or B12 deficiency or a brain tumor, or there are a host of things. It's important to get checked out, and the findings should be disclosed, and a plan of care should be developed that has ongoing management of care and support. So this is, So this is what we're promoting, but it has to be adopted, But this is the first time that set of guidelines has been presented. So again, things are accelerating, in different ways. The other thing that we know about Alzheimer's disease is because of, what I mentioned about the scientific revolution. So 100 years ago, when Dr. Alzheimer looked at Miss Augusta's brain under the microscope and saw those plaques and tangles, that was the only way to definitively diagnose Alzheimer's disease, was on autopsy. And that was true for a very long time, and it's still true in the technical sense. But the best research that has come out in the past 10 to 15 years has been related to imaging. So now scientists can look at the brain. They've developed tracers that bind to the beta amyloid, so you can see the amyloid in the brain. And they even now have a tracer, this is new, even more recent, that binds to tau and can look at tau in the brain. And that's where they have found that there's this long preclinical phase where changes in the brain are happening, but they're not significant enough to manifest in clinical symptoms. Does that make sense? So now we have this window where we can potentially work to make an intervention before the brain cells have died so much that there are clinical symptoms. We don't wait for the heart attack to happen to put someone on medication to prevent the heart attack. And that's my hope for the future of medications with Alzheimer's disease. And of course, I want a therapy that can slow the progression too, but I think that there will be in the next, years, something that could help stave off or postpone the onset of the clinical symptoms. Oh, and here you can see, so that's that PET imaging, a new kind of revolution. I am not a neuroscientist, but I can even tell, I can even read that. The colors are where there's damage to the brain. So we've got this preclinical stage, but how are we going to know? One, PET imaging is not covered by insurance, so it's very expensive right now. But what scientists are doing is that they're looking for biological markers in the body that can show us that these changes are happening, where we don't have to put everybody in a scan. So they're looking at markers in the spinal cord fluid, the cerebrospinal fluid. They're looking at developing tracers for MRIs, because MRIs are much more common and cheaper instruments to use. They're looking at CT scans. They're even looking at saliva. Last year, I don't think I have the slide this year, but last year I talked about a study that was looking at the nerve fiber layer in the eye. When you're developing in utero, it's brain tissue that the brain tissue and eye tissue, like the nerves for the eyes, come from the same place. So looking at changes in the nerves of the eye can actually tell you information about the brain. So wouldn't that be a great non-invasive test, to go to the doctor, and the eye doctor, to look and say, I think it's time to go see a different specialist, to go see a neurologist. And the Alzheimer's Association supports a global biomarker standardization consortium. So they are actively working on finding these biomarkers so that we can then develop the kind of intervention that can help postpone the onset of the disease. So this is a busy slide, but I want to show it to you because it shows you all the different ways that scientists are working. They're working in primary prevention to keep Alzheimer's pathology from even starting at all, to keep beta amyloid from going crazy in the brain, to prevent tau from getting hyperphosphorylated and creating those tangles. But they're looking at secondary prevention too, to decrease the beta amyloid in someone who already has it, to decrease the dying of the cells due to the tau accumulation, and to delay the onset of cognitive impairment. And then finally, when someone has mild cognitive impairment or full-blown dementia, to delay the progression of that dementia. To prevent neurons from dying, and to enhance the function of the neurons that are still there. So they're working, I promise. So that leads me to talk about treatment therapies. 2003, y'all, is when the last Alzheimer's medication, new medication, was approved by the FDA, but it is not for lack of trying. The disease is so complex. And the medicines that are out right now help with symptoms, but they don't help change the underlying pathology of the disease. Okay, what they do is they help, I told y'all that those long nerve cells talk to one another using neurotransmitters. And what the drugs do is that they improve the way that those neurotransmitters work with the nerve cells. But they don't stop the beta amyloid, they don't stop the tau. So that's why they help symptoms, but they don't slow the progression of the disease. And they don't work in everyone, they have side effects. There's more work that needs to be done. So this is an interesting study. It is not ready for prime time yet, but it's just something that I want to alert you to. We got disappointing news. You may have heard on the news that the aducanumab trial was stopped. But we learn things even when trials don't work, right? We still get more information. This is a different trial. Trials happen in phases, and so this is still an early phase trial, 2B, 856 people. They're targeting early Alzheimer's disease, and they're using PET scans, and at the highest dose, 81% of the participants reverted from amyloid positive status to amyloid negative status. This was also accompanied by a 30% decrease in the rate of cognitive decline. So not only did they get the beta amyloid out of their brains, the disease stopped progressing. but it's small, y'all. And so I don't want to, I want to temper, you know, I want to temper it. I want to tell you I'm really excited about it. But it needs to be done in bigger groups to understand more about the drug. I do want to tell y'all about some things that are going on. You know, MD Anderson is a cancer center, right? But they have a Neurodegeneration Consortium that's a consortium of many different institutions from all over the country, and they're working together to accelerate drug development for Alzheimer's, to leverage, because there are so many cancer medications, to leverage that knowledge and apply what we know about cancer to what we could know about nerve cells that are dying. So that's happening. There are trials that are happening in Houston. There's the Biggs Institute here in San Antonio. There's so much going on. So I don't want you to leave feeling hopeless. I want you to leave feeling encouraged and invigorated about what's going on, and then I want you to get involved. So this is the way that you can do it. What is, from those of y'all who were here last year, you know, what's the biggest barrier to finding treatment to Alzheimer's disease? It's money. It's money. That's the biggest barrier. We need more money. So I need you to sign up for those walks and to sign up for the longest day and to advocate like I talked about. But what's the second biggest barrier to Alzheimer's research? It's participants in clinical trials. So the Alzheimer's Association supports a program called Trial Match that is like Match.com or eHarmony for clinical trials. Okay? So Match.com doesn't marry you to the guy or the girl. It just connects you to the guy or the girl, and then you have to do all the work. Same with Trial Match. You go in and you fill out a completely confidential profile, and then Trial Match will put it in the database of all of the clinical trials that are on the government's website. And the computer will say, oh, you're not eligible for this one. Oh, you are eligible for this one, but it's too far away, but you're eligible for this one, and it's within, such and such miles. And then it'll just tell you, hey, you're a match for this one particular study, or these two particular studies, and then you can decide if you want to reach out and join that study. You are in the driver's seat with that. We need healthy participants to participate in clinical trials. We need caregivers to participate in clinical trials. And I do want to say, not all trials are drug trials. The Pointer study is about lowering risk. Maybe that's the study that can, help us learn what can keep Alzheimer's from emerging. So some of them are stress tests, some of them are surveys. So there's a lot of different kinds, but I would encourage you, it's free, and it's confidential, and you can get more information by going to Trial Match, alz.org/trialmatch. We need money. Longest day is coming up. The day with the most light is the day we fight. So you pick an activity that you love, pick an activity that honors your loved ones, and then engage in that activity. I personally would like to sleep. Just kidding. But not really. The walks are coming up in the fall when the weather gets nice. Like, imagine the weather right now, we'll forget about summer, and then it'll be like this again when the walks come. It's free to register, and I hope you'll come out. But I hope you'll come out not just because of the fundraising component to it. I hope you'll come out for the solidarity. If you want to see what solidarity and hope looks like, come out with over 1,000 people who are there walking for the very same reason you are, who are walking to support our vision of a world without Alzheimer's. I walk in honor of my family. I walk in honor of every single one of you. I want to thank you for your investment in research, for your interest in it, for staying with me through this, and your attendance is a sign of your commitment. We have about 15 minutes, and so I want to thank you, and I want to open the floor to questions. Yes, ma'am.
So I was reading recently a study where they were studying the neuro cells that create or produce estrogen and the effect of decreased estrogen on memory function in rats. What do you think about that? I mean, is that
Yeah, I think some of that information that we got from the Kaiser Permanente study is going to help us start to unpack that. I definitely do think that estrogen has an effect in what happens in the brain. I don't know or understand the mechanism of that yet, but I think there is something there.
the reason I'm focusing on that is my mother had breast cancer and it was estrogen responsive, and so they gave her estrogen longer. And I've seen anecdotal things posted on websites that said people stop taking it because of quality of life issues. And I'm not asking for medical advice. I'm just wondering if that's the thing. I mean,
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that they're looking at when they're trying to understand how things like chemo brain relate or don't relate to something like dementia. So I think you're definitely onto something.
thank you very much.
Yeah.
So you mentioned, you talked about how they've,
Psych.
sorry. Developed, I'll just yell, how they developed the tracers, that bind to the beta amyloid and the tau, that show that there's that really long preclinical phase before the symptoms. So I know it must be brand new, so we don't know, but are there results yet that show that those in whom we've identified the physical pathology, and it's sort of deterministic, they will
That they will. No.
Alzheimer's?
No, isn't that fascinating? So no, not everyone that has raging beta amyloid in their brain will develop Alzheimer's. There was a study a while back of a group of nuns. And these nuns were very active, and these nuns all donated their brains when they died. And they did lots of studies about the nuns' activities. They had the nuns write things, and the nuns were very socially active, mentally engaged. And when they looked at their brains, many of them had quite a lot of beta amyloid. So some scientists are really, I know a lot of scientists are really interested in it, but some are choosing that to look at why some folks are protected from Alzheimer's even though they have this beta amyloid. And really what it tells you is that the story is so much more complex than what we can get our head around. So they're also looking at neuroinflammation. There's some evidence that suggests that if you're under chronic stress, you're at a higher risk. And because if you're under chronic stress, you're constantly releasing inflammatory hormones, and over a chronic period of time, that can have an effect. We also know that caregivers have worse health outcomes because they're under a lot of stress. So please use the Alzheimer's Association care and support options for you. But yeah, your question is so right on. They're looking at glucose intolerance in the brain. They're looking at tiny strokes that happen, even at the microscopic level. Now they've found inside the cells that the tau can leak out of the cell. And now we've got tau floating around in between the brain cells rather than just inside. So the story, the more that you pick at the story, the more and more layers and complicated that it becomes. But you're right, no, if they find the beta amyloid in the brain, it is not determined that you're going to get it, but you would be at a higher risk. Yes, ma'am.
Someone over there.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, yes.
So my question is in regards to the barriers. So you said one is money, the second one is participation. What do you think is preventing people from participating? Is it cultural? Is it cost associated with clinical and research participation?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are no costs associated with it. Historically, I say we as like Americans, have not done a good job of protecting our research subjects. So there is a history of subject abuse. So my training is as an ethicist, so this really, really matters to me. And I am proud that every trial that is on Trial Match, and every trial that's on US, the government website now, has gone through strict review to make sure that the subjects are protected. But yes, there are cultural differences, and there is stigma still attached to it. You know, if you don't even want to tell, if your family wants to keep that private and take care of it in the home, then you're not as eager, potentially, to participate in clinical trials. I think there's a lot of fear about it, fear connected to it too. And so that's another thing that we can do is have those conversations to say, not everyone, you're not a guinea pig, you know, that there are lots of different kinds of trials, and you always have the option to be able to drop out if you feel like it's not working for you.
After you just said that you don't take care of the people too well, you know, that are participants in the trial, I don't know if I would want to participate now, you know, by just hearing you saying that.
Well, that was 50 years ago, and there have been significant advancements in the way that people are protected. There's significant regulations, and every trial goes through what's called an institutional review board. And what that review board does, their only job is to look and make sure that the research is good, that it's well thought out, and that its subjects are protected.
Okay, that was my question.
But yeah.
Okay, does your research suggest or support the fact that autism may be a risk factor to developing Alzheimer's?
There is not any research that I know of that connects autism to Alzheimer's. There may be some out there, but there's not any that I know of.
I couldn't keep up with you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, that's okay, I write slow and you talk fast. So, are your slides available somewhere, or is there something, where can you get more information on the studies?
Yes, you can always go to alz.org/research. And that takes us to our research homepage, and you can spend quite a lot of time just tootling around there. As far as the slides go, I'm happy to send them to Miss Jenny, and she can distribute them out. Yeah, I'd be happy to do that.
Call the local chapter.
So call the local chapter, 800-272-3900.
Given all the new research that's coming out, you mentioned on the slides, insurance issues, and primary care is not wanting to send them to specialists. Are we doing anything, or are y'all doing anything that will help insurance to move in the direction of covering the coverage, but then also attacking these medical care groups with primary cares that incentivize their primary care physicians not to send them to specialists?
Yeah, I don't think that it's for lack of, I don't want to villainize the primary care docs. I think they are doing the best they can. Yes, but the short answer to your question is yes. And now there is a Medicare code, a permanent Medicare code, where physicians can be reimbursed for advanced Alzheimer care planning. Yes, and it can be reimbursed, it can be used more than once. So it's now incentivizing docs to have the conversations and to have the conversations over multiple visits. So yeah, we are. Okay.
Are there any programs that are being started within the medical education institutions for training the doctors in their education?
Oh my gosh, you're speaking my language. Because medical education is very important to me. I don't know that there's anything systematically across the country. I do know that students are being, they're being taught in their medical school classes. There is so much that medical students have to learn. And I think that also their training goes on into their graduate medical education training, but I think there could be more. We don't have as many folks going into geriatrics as into other potentially higher paid specialties. So continuing to do that advocacy work to call out the importance of it is one way to keep moving that needle. Culture change happens slowly, but continuing to have those conversations, things then start to ramp up.
Boy, the pipes are from glen to glen and down the mountainside. The summer's gone and all the roses falling. 'Tis you must go and I must bide. But come here.